And it's at this point that I'm delighted to welcome the first of our two experts on the panel amongst our three farmers here. Sean McCann, who's a chartered financial planner with NFU Mutual, 25 years experience of advising farmers and landowners on inheritance tax and pension planning. Sean.
Okay, thanks Terry. Good afternoon everyone. Now we know it's the aim of many farmers to pass the farm on to the next generation. Some are happy to do this during their lifetime, others want to hold on to it until the day they die. Now there is no right answer to that question, but however you decide to hand it on, it's really important to have a plan. Because having a plan not only makes for a smoother transition whenever that happens, but it can also go a long way to protecting the future of the family farm. Now a key part of that plan is tax, because the aim is to pass that business on and pay as little tax as possible. Now there's two key taxes to think about. The first is inheritance tax, which in its most simple form is a tax on what we leave behind when we die. Because normally the first £325,000 is tax-free. After that it's taxed at a flat rate of 40 pence in the pound. And just to give you an idea of the sort of hole it can make in a family's wealth, a married couple, civil partners, leaving an estate worth £1 million, the children may have to find up to 140,000 before they can get their hands on the assets. An estate of 3 million, almost a third of it goes to the taxman. Okay, so it is an important issue. That's the bad news. Okay, you'll be pleased to hear there is some good news if you own farming assets. Very generous relief designed to allow people to pass on farms without them being broken up through inheritance tax. Now, if you're a farmer and you own and farm your own farm, and you've owned and farmed it for at least 2 years, you should get 100% agricultural property relief. And what that means is the agricultural value of that asset can be left down to the next generation with no inheritance tax. Similarly, if you've got land that you let out, as long as you've owned it for at least 7 years, throughout that time it's been farmed by you or somebody else, and you've got the right to vacant possession within 2 years, or you've got a tenancy granted since September 1995, again, that'll be completely free of inheritance tax. And it's that relief that's led to quite a lot of inflation in farmland prices. Wealthy people who have nothing to do with farming, buying farmland in order to get the tax break. And there's also a really important relief for farmers as well, called business property relief, which is designed to allow people to hand on trading businesses free of inheritance tax. So this will be useful to you for your tractors, your machinery, your live and dead stock. As long as you've had it for at least 2 years, you should be able to pass that down completely exempt from inheritance tax as well. But it can be really useful if you've got any sort of development potential on your land and buildings. So we know you have an acre of land, let's say the agricultural value is maybe £9,000 or £10,000, but the development value is £500,000. If you're still farming that yourself, you should get agricultural property relief on the 10,000, making that tax-free, and business property relief on the £500,000 development value. The problem comes if you're not farming that land anymore. So perhaps you've let it out to somebody else who's doing the farming. While you still might get the agricultural property relief on the 10,000, there'll be no relief on the £500,000 development value. So those of you who've got any sort of development potential, land or buildings, keep using them in your business until you decide what to do with them. A couple of other things just to be conscious of as well. Some farmers, when they go into business with the next generation, they bring the next generation into the partnership. But what they do is keep the land and the buildings away from the partnership. It's off the balance sheet. The view is they're protecting that in case of any failed marriages or whatever. The problem that brings is that potentially you will only get 50% business property relief if you were to die on any sort of development potential. Now there are ways and means around that, which I won't bore you with today, but it's important you take some advice to solve that problem. A couple of other traps just to be wary of as well. Let's say I've got a £2 million farm and I give it to my children during my lifetime, and I die within 7 years. And during that 7-year period, the children have got tired of farming and they've sold it. So what they've done, they've turned an asset, farmland, that is tax-free, into a great big pile of money that's taxable. So if I die within 7 years of giving it to them, it's tested again, that money is brought back into my estate and tested again for agricultural property relief, and it's not going to qualify. So the children are going to end up with a bill of 40% of that. You can also get agricultural property relief on your farmhouse, but there's a number of hurdles you've got to jump. The first hurdle you've got to jump is that farmhouse has got to be occupied for the purposes of agriculture. The person living there has got to be actually doing the day-to-day farming. So let's take a common example of a farmer. Perhaps his children aren't interested in the farm, so he stays in the farmhouse, but he lets all his land out on a farm business tenancy. So while he may still get relief on the land, he won't get any relief on the house. The reason being, he's not living there to do the day-to-day farming. And again, there are ways around that, but it's important to take some advice. I was interested to hear James say he started his glamping business. Diversification can also bring some issues with agricultural and business property relief. So if you take a simple example of a farmer who takes a derelict building, converts it into a workshop and lets it out and gets a rent from that, that's not agriculture anymore, no agricultural property relief, and it's not his trading business. He's getting a passive income from it. So the starting point is to assume he won't get any relief on that. Okay, so if you're giving assets away during your lifetime, the other one to look out for is capital gains tax. A lot of people realise if they sell something for more than they bought it for, they pay capital gains tax. But you can also pay capital gains tax when you give something away and don't receive any money for it. So capital gains tax is important if you're giving away business assets during your lifetime. It's also worth remembering that capital gains tax is washed away on death. Because to give you a simple example, a friend of mine is an accountant in the Midlands. He had a customer who, this lady was a farmer's daughter. She'd been given a share portfolio when her father died. She'd had it for about 20, 30 years, and it was full of gain. Now, unfortunately, her husband was quite seriously ill. So my friend, the accountant, said, well, one thing you could do is assign those shares to your husband. There's no capital gains tax, but if he doesn't survive, the capital gain will be washed away on his death. And you get them back, you can sell them with no capital gains tax. So that's exactly what she did. Unfortunately, her husband did pass away, but when it came to reading the will, instead of giving them back to her, he left them to his nurse. Okay? So you have got to be a bit careful with tax planning. Okay, so there is some good news if you are giving away assets during your lifetime. If you're giving away farming assets, because there's a really valuable relief called holdover relief. So I could give my farm I bought for £100,000 30 years ago. Today it's worth £1 million. I could give it to my children and hold over the capital gains. There'll be no capital gains tax on that gift. But if the children sell it, let's say it's grown to 1.1 million, and they sell it and get out of farming completely, they'll face capital gains tax on £1 million. So claiming this doesn't get rid of capital gains tax, it defers it to the future. Okay, non-farming children, this is an important issue as well, because there's always, amongst a lot of families, there's a desire to be fair to all the children. Now, treating all the children fairly doesn't necessarily mean treating them equally. So there can be some recognition of the sweat capital, the sweat equity that the farming children have invested in the business. So there's a number of different options, and just to look at a few of these, obviously a very simple one is to give away non-farming property. That's pretty simple. Another way of doing it is to look at the management and the ownership of the farm as separate issues. So while you might give the day-to-day management of the farm to one or two children, you could potentially share the ownership between all the children, with the non-farming children receiving a rent for their share of the business. Or you could build up funds outside the business. There's a number of different ways you can do that. One of the ways that you can do is you could take out a life insurance policy in trust. That will produce a tax-free lump sum for the non-farming children to compensate them potentially for not getting a share of the farming business. You can also take advantage of some of the changes this man introduced. Any money you leave in your pension fund when you die is normally completely free of inheritance tax. So we've got a lot of farming customers who keep paying money into their pension up to age 75 with absolutely no intention of ever taking the money. What they're doing, for every £80 they pay in, the government paying another 20, and they're building up that fund with the intention of leaving it to non-farming children. Okay, final important thing I'll say is wills and agreements. It's key that to make sure these assets end up in the right hands at the right time is making sure you've got up-to-date wills and agreements and making sure they don't contradict each other as well. Because if you don't have wills and agreements in place, the law decides what happens. And I'm sure we all know stories where that's led to disputes and ultimately led to the for sale sign going up on the farm. And obviously I think James mentioned it, is to keep these under regular review. So I'll leave you with 4 things, 4 points. What I'd say, if you're going to plan early. The earlier you plan, the more options you've got. Maximise the tax breaks, because they're really valuable, but they're quite easy to lose. Involve the whole family as well. I don't think it's a good idea for mum and dad to make these plans in isolation without talking to the whole family. And most importantly, take some advice. Thank you.
Sean, huge thank you. Now it's my great pleasure to ask Abby Reader to come to the podium. Abby probably is the busiest person in Welsh agriculture.
Right, thanks very much, Terry. Probably the first thing I've been thinking how exactly to start this off, and perhaps the first thing I would say is, if you'd asked me about 6 or 7 years ago to stand up and do a talk about succession, I would have laughed my head off. I've been trying to think about exactly how I put into words how my succession has taken place. But there's been no logical process to it. Unfortunately, I would describe my succession as a bit of a poor man's succession, but I wouldn't say that it's a failure. It's just that it's been more reactive than proactive. So in terms of the business, my father and my uncle own the business, both very similar in age, both two men in their 70s now. Worked extremely well. There was also myself working in the business, and I have a sister who isn't working on the farm. My uncle has 3 daughters, none of them are on the farm. My mother does a lot of work on the farm as well. It's not paperwork, it's proper hands-on, important stock work. And we got to a point where we had a trigger, and the trigger was about 7 years ago. My father was taken ill, and it immediately wiped him out of the business. Fortunately, he's still with us, but he just got completely cut out of the equation. So he and I were in charge of the dairy side of the business, and my uncle was in charge of the sheep, the arable, and the beef. And it left a huge problem, because suddenly, my uncle, who hadn't really stepped much into the dairy side, wasn't entirely sure what to do. And whilst I had been working with my father, he'd very much kept his plans here. So we suddenly got to this point where I was just cold turkey, and my uncle said, well, you're going to have to take care of it. And I literally didn't know what to do. And it was down to the point of I couldn't sign checks, so how could I pay the staff? Who was going to pay the feed bills? Where was the next load of straw going to come from? These were all immediate problems. So I would say with succession, there's all sorts of different problems. We've heard with James, he's talked about assets, but actually there's the short-term issues with succession. There's the long-term sustainability of your business, and then there are the assets on top of that. So certainly in terms of the short term, it was a real problem. And perhaps more than that, because my father had played his cards so close to his chest, it was very difficult to try and honour his wishes and to keep the business running as he would like it to run, because 1, I didn't know how, and 2, I actually couldn't manage it on my own. So it made it quite complicated. In terms of trying to get staff to cover for him, I couldn't hire anyone because I had no authority in the business. So it caused all sorts of issues like that. Then we had to consider some of the more long-term issues. So, I started thinking in my head, what happens if something happens to my uncle as well? Would the milk check still come in? Then we'd be in real trouble. If we suddenly didn't have money coming in, how were we going to pay, regardless of whether you could sign the checkbook or not? And they did find a little way around the signing of the checkbook. In terms of further long-term decision-making, further long-term sustainability of the business, it was then all down to decision-making. So suddenly there I was speaking for my father. So that was fine, didn't have a problem with that, but I was still considered to be an employee. So I was taking on all the responsibility of the business, but I didn't have any of the power, and that caused a lot of resentment. Equally then you could say, on my uncle's side, he felt like he was shouldering a lot of the business because his business partner could no longer do it. And then, of course, there was my father right on the end, who was too ill to decide anything, and no one knew whether we were honouring his wishes or not and continuing the business to sort of the best of our abilities for him. So it did bring a lot of problems on board for us. However, it did start a process of talking, and it was quite a painful process. I'm very grateful to NFU Mutual and their financial planning for that, because I have to say they were fantastic, and our group secretary was very supportive, as was our land agent. There are all sorts of issues that you have to consider. If you're looking then at assets, the assets were almost slightly lesser of a concern for me at the time, because all I'm interested in at the moment is trying to keep the business going. But it was great to see guidance then in terms of wills, because suddenly with a will, I had a little bit of a clearer, because I was made aware of what was in the will, in both wills, had a little bit of a clearer image of exactly what I might be left with at the end. And that's quite important, because if I'm looking at developing the business long term and growing it, I don't really know where I'm what direction I'm going to be pushing it in. Bearing in mind, my uncle doesn't have any children in the business, so he wants the business to go that way, and I want to go that way, so it makes it very difficult. But if you know what's in the will and what might be coming to you in the future, then it did help quite a bit. I think there's other little bits and pieces of advice that I could offer. So I became very aware that I was perhaps in quite a risky situation before I became a partner in the business. So I went on a number of courses, listened to a number of seminars, and had a lot of advice about how you deal with succession. And one of the best pieces of advice I had of a lady called Sian Bushell is, if in doubt, try and manage your own succession. And when I spoke to her a little bit about it, she meant set yourself up for the worst case scenario. So I started saving up money. I spoke to a cousin. We put shares in a house, and I now have a house. Well, the bank owns part of it, but I now have a house, which means if something goes wrong, I have somewhere to live. I also focus on keeping my skills up, so that if I did suddenly find myself out of work, I would be employable somewhere else. And it sounds a little bit extreme and a bit far-fetched, but it made me feel so much better that I had a little bit of a buffer zone there in the background just to keep me going. So yeah, probably I'll just finish off. A couple of triggers further down the line in terms of successions. Obviously, we had sickness. That was one of them. The next one was my uncle became a grandfather. So that was another. Suddenly his outlook's changed again. We realized that we needed a new milking parlour, and my uncle wanted a new mower as well, and he realized that you could get better finance if you had somebody under 40 in the business, so that was quite appealing for him. In terms of the new milking parlour, he also realized that it would make us look much more appealing for a grant. So, suddenly there are lots of reasons why, if you have a succession plan in place and you do include someone younger in the business, it can bring you more opportunities for the now, which is equally as important. So I suppose my final bit of advice is it can be very stressful, but try not to come off the back foot, because the journey that I've had over the last 7 years has been very interesting, and I wouldn't really recommend it to anyone. We have got through it. I'm now a partner in the business. I've been a partner in the business for 2 years. Does make me feel a lot better, and probably I would finish off. It was interesting to see that everybody had put, or a lot of people had put there, that one of the most difficult things about succession is sitting around the table talking to your family. I think it was about 2 months ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, I did an interview with a vegan in my house. I sat around the table with this vegan activist extremist and a Radio 4 presenter and myself, and it slightly alarmed me that that was an easier conversation than the one I had about succession. So yeah, thank you very much.